The morning Emily Carter arrived at work. She did what she always did. Stepped out of her matte black luxury sedan, adjusted her blazer, and surveyed the gleaming glass facade of Carter Performance Automotive with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had built something worth surveying. She was 32 years old, and she had earned every square foot of that building. The company bore her family name, but she had rebuilt it from the ground up after her father's retirement, transformed it from a mid-tier performance brand into one of the most talked-about hypercar manufacturers in the world. Automotive journalists called her a prodigy. Investors called her relentless. Her employees called her not always affectionately the engine because she never stopped running, and she expected nothing less from the people around her. She was sharp in ways that made boardrooms go quiet, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of someone who had never once needed to be rescued. The headquarters sat on the edge of a pristine industrial campus in Michigan. All clean lines and polished concrete. The kind of space that said precision and excellence before a single word was spoken. Emily had designed the lobby herself, insisted on the lighting, chosen the titanium display cases that held scale models of every car they had ever produced. She cared about image the way an artist cares about a canvas, because image was a language, and she had learned to speak it fluently. So when she stepped out of the elevator that Tuesday morning and glanced through the lobby glass toward the visitor parking lot, the rusted pickup truck sitting between a Porsche and a gleaming company SUV struck her like a wrong note in a symphony. It was an old Ford, not vintage in a charming way, not restored with loving care into something handsome. It was simply old and worn, the kind of truck that had been driven hard for decades and maintained just enough to keep running. The passenger side mirror was held in place with tape. There was a dent along the rear quarter panel that had never been fixed. The paint, once red, had faded to a chalky rust brown that matched its own oxidizing trim. Emily stared at it for a moment longer than she should have. And then, she saw the man who had climbed out of it. He was in his late 30s, average height, wearing clean but unremarkable clothes, dark work pants, a flannel shirt, boots that had seen better years. He carried a manila folder tucked under one arm and walked toward the entrance with an unhurried calm that somehow irritated her more than the truck had. There was nothing aggressive about him, nothing demanding. He simply walked as though he belonged wherever he happened to be, which, Emily decided, was precisely the wrong attitude for someone who very clearly did not belong here. She moved toward the lobby without fully deciding to intercept him. By the time she reached the entrance atrium, the man was at the reception desk, speaking quietly to the front desk attendant. A small cluster of engineers had gathered nearby, waiting for a morning briefing, and 2 security staff stood at their usual stations. It was an audience Emily did not consciously register, but whose presence she always felt. She stopped a few feet away and looked at the man with the frank, unguarded appraisal she gave most things she was evaluating. "Delivering something?" she asked. He turned. His eyes were steady, a calm gray blue, and he looked at her without surprise or deference. "Technical documentation," he said. "For the R&D team." I was invited. Emily glanced at the folder, then back at the parking lot beyond the glass. "You drove that truck here?" Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression, but he said nothing. "We build $12 million vehicles on this campus," she said. And her voice carried the easy amusement of someone who did not realize how sharp the edge of that amusement was. "Maybe next time park around the side. That thing looks like it belongs on a salvage lot, not in front of our entrance." A few people within earshot looked away. One engineer near the elevator found something very interesting to examine on his phone. The receptionist kept her eyes fixed carefully on her monitor. The man looked at Emily for a moment. Then he set the folder on the reception desk and said, quietly and without heat, "I'll keep that in mind." He signed the visitor log, accepted his badge, and followed the escort who appeared to guide him toward the engineering wing. He did not look back. Emily watched him go, registered a faint flicker of something she did not examine too closely, and then turned her attention to the day ahead. She had a company to run. She had a hypercar to launch. She did not have time to think about a man in a flannel shirt. Nobody told her his name. Nobody thought to. The drive home took Jack Miller 40 minutes, and he spent most of it with the radio off. Lily had track practice after school on Tuesdays, so he had an extra hour before pickup, and he used the quiet to decompress in the way he had learned over the past 3 years, not by analyzing what had happened, not by rehearsing better responses, but simply by letting the miles pass beneath him and the familiar smell of the old truck settle around him like something worn in and honest. The truck smelled like machine oil, and the lavender air freshener Lily had clipped to the vent last spring. It smelled like everything the two of them carried with them. He had stopped being embarrassed about the truck a long time ago. Around the same time, he stopped being embarrassed about a great many things. The house was modest in the way that things built for function rather than impression tend to be modest, a 2-bedroom in a quiet neighborhood outside the city, with a yard large enough for Lily to have her corner where she kept her tomato plants and the old swing set she had long since outgrown, but refused to let him take down. He had bought it 3 years ago, after Sarah died, when he had taken stock of what he actually needed and what he had simply accumulated. He needed enough space for himself and Lily, a garage for his work, and proximity to a good school. Everything else had been negotiable. What he had given up, most people who knew him professionally would have considered staggering. At 34, he had been a senior principal engineer at one of the most advanced performance vehicle development firms in the country, leading a team that was rewriting what was possible in high-performance chassis dynamics and control architecture. He had patents. He had offers from manufacturers in 3 countries. He had a salary that made people's eyes widen slightly when it came up. And then Sarah's diagnosis arrived, and the world reorganized itself completely and without asking his permission. He took a leave. The leave became a resignation. The resignation became something he never looked back at with regret, only with the particular grief of a path not taken, which is a different thing entirely. The pickup had been Sarah's idea. She had found it at an estate sale in the summer before she got sick, and she had loved it immediately and without apology loved its size, its utility. Loved that it had a story attached to it, that it had been used and used well and was still standing. She was like that about things. She believed in keeping what worked. She believed in not discarding something just because it had begun to show its age. Jack had teased her about it, the way they teased each other about everything, and she had said, "Every dent is a decision someone made." I like things that have made decisions. He had understood her completely, which was the condition of their entire marriage. After she died, he could not have gotten rid of the truck any more than he could have gotten rid of her books or her handwriting on the grocery list he still had, folded in the kitchen drawer. It was not sentimentality. It was continuity. It was the thread. He picked Lily up from the school parking lot at 5:30. She came running across the lot the way she always did, ponytail swinging, backpack bouncing, and she threw herself into the passenger seat with the momentum of someone who had been looking forward to this exact moment for hours. She was 10, and she was, in Jack's entirely unbiased assessment, the most remarkable person he had ever met. She had Sarah's eyes and her own very particular way of seeing the world. "How'd it go?" she asked, already reaching for the water bottle in the center console. "Fine," he said. Dropped off the documents. Spoke to the front desk. "Did you see the cars?" From a distance, she accepted this and moved on, because Lily was not a person who dwelled. She told him about her math test, about the argument her best friend had with the girl in the row behind her, about a documentary someone had shown in science class, about deep-sea creatures that had temporarily convinced her she wanted to be a marine biologist. Jack listened to all of it with the full attention he gave her always, because this was the agreement he had made with himself and with the memory of Sarah, that Lily would never feel like a secondary priority. She would never wonder if she mattered. That was the one thing he would not compromise. Later, after dinner, after homework, after the chapter of the book they were reading together before bed, he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and looked at the notification on his phone, a brief message from a man named Dennis Falk, a senior systems engineer he had worked with a decade ago, who now held a senior position in Carter Performance's R&D division. The message read simply, "We may need to talk. Can I call you tomorrow?" Jack set the phone down. He looked at the garage door across the kitchen. behind which sat the workbench where he consulted on small projects, designed modifications for independent racing teams, and kept his mind from going soft. He thought about the woman in the lobby with the careful blazer, and the reflexive cruelty that came so naturally to her it probably did not register as cruelty at all. He thought about the folder he had delivered, containing technical analysis he had spent 3 weeks preparing because Dennis had asked him. And because the problem was genuinely interesting, and because he had never been able to walk away from a genuinely interesting problem, he typed back, "Sure, anytime after 9. Then he turned off the kitchen light and went to check on Lily. The Aurora project had been 4 years in the making. Carter Performance had poured resources into it the way a river pours into a narrowing canyon with increasing speed, increasing pressure, and no possibility of turning back. The Aurora Mach 1 was not simply a fast car. It was, according to every specification sheet and press release the company had issued, a redefinition of what a road-legal vehicle could be. $12 million, 0 to 60 in less than 2 seconds. A top speed that had not been publicly confirmed because the testing figures were not yet fully verified. Active aerodynamic systems that responded to road conditions in real time. A thermal management architecture that was, and this was the phrase the engineers used, when they thought they were out of earshot of the marketing team, genuinely unlike anything that had ever been attempted in a production vehicle. The global launch event was scheduled for Saturday. 68 media organizations had confirmed attendance. 14 major investors, several of whom had committed to purchasing the first production vehicles, would be present. The event was being live-streamed. The governor's office had sent a congratulatory letter. Emily Carter had been preparing for this moment for 4 years and had not slept more than 5 hours in a single night for the past 3 weeks. On Wednesday morning, in the controlled environment of the company's private test facility 40 minutes from headquarters, the Aurora Mk1 lost stability at 162 miles per hour. The test driver, a man with 19 years of experience, a man who had pushed prototypes to their limits on 3 continents, managed to bring the car to a safe stop through what was partly skill and partly the cooperation of a vehicle that had not, technically, fully malfunctioned. But the telemetry data told the story with brutal clarity. The active control systems had produced a response pattern that should not have been possible given the system's design parameters. The rear aerodynamic load had fluctuated in a way that created a brief, violent instability at speed. Had it happened 10 miles per hour faster, in a slightly different configuration, the outcome might not have been a near miss. It might have been a catastrophe. Emily got the call at 9:47 in the morning and arrived at the test facility by 10:30. By noon, she had spoken to every senior engineer on the project. By 2 o'clock, the scope of the problem had become apparent enough that the room had gone very quiet. The kind of quiet that precedes very bad news. The active control architecture was behaving in ways that deviated from the design models, and nobody could identify with confidence why. They had theories. They had data. They did not have an answer. Emily stood at the end of the conference table and looked at the people she had hired. The people she trusted. The people who were collectively some of the best credentialed automotive engineers in the country, and she said, with great care and control, "I need a solution. Not a theory. A solution. And I need it before Saturday." She left the room. She stood in the corridor and pressed her palms flat against the wall and breathed. The launch could not be cancelled. The cost was not only financial, it was the company's credibility, the narrative they had spent 4 years building, the faith of investors who had put real money behind a belief that Carter Performance could do something the industry had never seen. She needed the car fixed. She needed it fixed now. The thing no one outside a company in crisis understands is how physical it feels. It is not an abstract pressure. It moves through the body the way cold does into the shoulders, into the jaw, into the space behind the eyes. Emily had managed difficult situations before. She had navigated a recall, a legal dispute with a supplier, a board coup that had lasted 3 months and cost her 2 people she had considered allies. She knew the weight of things going wrong, but this was different. The Aurora was not a crisis among many things she was responsible for. The Aurora was the thing. It was the 4 years. It was the bet she had made on herself and her team, and on the idea that this company could stand beside the best in the world and not be diminished. If the launch failed, if the car failed publicly, if it failed catastrophically, she would not simply lose a product cycle. She would lose the version of herself she had spent a decade building. She was not proud of how much that mattered to her. But it did. She needed the car fixed. She needed it fixed now. It was Dennis Falk who said the name. He said it quietly, at the end of an hour-long session that had produced no viable conclusions, as if he were not entirely sure it was appropriate to say it at all. "There's one person," he said, "one person who knows the foundation architecture, the way we need someone to know it right now." The room waited. "Jack Miller," Dennis said. "He designed the core control logic that everything we're running is built on. The system is 3 generations, evolved from his original framework. But the bones are his. If there's a structural incompatibility somewhere between his original design intent and what we've layered on top of it, he's the only person who would see it." The room absorbed this. Emily looked up. "Who?" And Dennis said the name again. And Emily felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. She remembered the manila folder. She remembered the flannel shirt. She remembered the truck. She remembered what she had said. The call was made by Dennis first, which was a small mercy. He reached Jack at just after 4 in the afternoon, explained the situation in technical terms, and was told, politely but firmly, that Jack had Lily's school recital that evening and a prior commitment the following morning. Dennis conveyed this to the leadership team with the careful neutrality of someone delivering a message they know will not be well received. Emily made the call herself at 5:15. The phone rang 3 times. When Jack answered, his voice was calm, the background carrying the faint sounds of what might have been a kitchen. She identified herself, her full name, her title, her company. And there was a pause that lasted precisely long enough to be meaningful. "I'm aware of who you are," he said. She had prepared for this call the way she prepared for difficult negotiations. She had written notes. She had anticipated objections. She had not anticipated how inadequate preparation would feel when applied to this particular conversation. "Mr. Miller," she said, "I'm calling because the company needs your expertise. The Aurora's control architecture has developed a critical instability that none of our current engineers can trace. You designed the foundational system. We may not be able to resolve this before our launch." A silence. "I'll be honest with you," she continued. And the words cost her something she could not quite measure. "I'm asking for your help. I understand if you have reservations about working with us. I have a daughter," he said. "She's my priority. I understand. We would work around your schedule. We would make every accommodation." Another silence, longer this time. She heard what sounded like a small voice in the background, asking something she could not make out. Then Jack's voice, muffled, as if he had lowered the phone. "Give me a minute, Lily." Bug. When he came back, he said, "Send me the telemetry files tonight. I'll look at them. I'm not promising anything." "Thank you," Emily said. She said it simply, without qualifiers, which was not how she usually said anything. He arrived the following morning at 8, and this time there was no manila folder under his arm. He walked into the building with a laptop bag and a travel mug of coffee, and if any part of him registered the lobby that had been the setting of his humiliation 2 days prior, he gave no indication of it. Dennis met him at the entrance and walked him through to the main engineering complex. And, as they moved through the building, something interesting happened that Emily, watching from across the atrium, had not fully anticipated. People recognized him, not everyone, but the engineers who had been in the field long enough, who had studied the foundational literature, who had come up through programs where certain names were spoken with a particular kind of reverence. They looked up when Jack Miller walked past, and they looked up the way people look up when something they have read about and never expected to see appears in front of them. A woman in her 50s who ran the aerodynamics team caught sight of him and said, quietly but clearly, "Is that actually Jack Miller?" A younger engineer next to her said, "Who?" And she replied, with the patience of someone correcting a significant gap in knowledge, "The man who wrote the control logic that made modern hypercar dynamics possible. Before what he built, we were guessing." The younger engineer looked at the man in the flannel shirt with new eyes. Jack did not appear to notice any of this. He walked with his coffee and his quiet calm. And when he reached the conference room where the data had been assembled, he set down his bag, opened his laptop, and looked at Dennis and said, "Walk me through what happened. Start from the first anomaly." Emily stood near the back of the room. She had told herself she was there to monitor the situation. She was, in fact, there because she did not know what else to do with herself, and because she owed this man something she was not yet sure how to pay. He had not looked at her when he entered. He had nodded once, a brief and courteous acknowledgement, and then turned his attention to the problem. It was the professionalism of someone who had long ago learned to separate what a situation felt like from what it required. She watched him read. He read the way very few people read, not scanning, not searching for confirmation, but absorbing, building a model in real time, cross-referencing things that existed only inside his head. He asked precise questions. He requested specific data subsets. He put the telemetry on the main screen and sat in silence for a long time, and the room waited around him with the particular patience of people who have realized they are in the presence of someone operating at a level they cannot follow. At 11:14 in the morning, he said, "Here." He was pointing at a section of the control algorithm's response timing. To an untrained eye, it looked like a rounding artifact, a tiny numerical deviation, the kind of thing that gets dismissed as noise in complex systems. Jack pointed at it and said, "This value was adjusted in the third-generation revision. Slightly, whoever made the change was correcting for a sensor latency issue, and the correction was technically valid within the parameters they were working in. But the original architecture was designed with a very specific tolerance relationship between this timing value and the load transfer calculation in the rear diffuser system. When you change one without accounting for the other, you create a resonance condition at high speed that the system can't compensate for, not at 160, maybe not even at 140, under the right atmospheric conditions, but under load, at high temperature, at the speeds you're pushing this vehicle to. Yes, the system will fight itself." The room was silent. Emily looked at the screen. She looked at the data. She could follow the broad logic of what he was describing, but the specific mechanism was beyond her without more time and study. Around her, the engineers were processing it differently. She could see it happening in real time, the slow dawning of comprehension, the moment when a pattern resolves from noise into signal. A woman 2 chairs down said, very quietly, "Oh my God," not dramatically, with the reverence of someone who had just understood something that had been invisible to her a moment before. "Can it be fixed?" Dennis asked. Jack said, "Yes. Give me the development environment and 6 hours." He worked through the afternoon and into the evening. He worked the way Emily imagined very few people still worked in an industry that had learned to distribute effort across teams and timelines with a focused, single-minded immersion that seemed to exclude everything outside the problem. He ate a sandwich that someone brought without acknowledging that he had eaten it. He answered questions from the engineering team with the patience of a teacher who genuinely enjoyed the transmission of understanding. He wrote code and tested it and refined it and tested it again. And when Emily passed the room at 7 in the evening and glanced through the glass, he was still there. Leaning toward the screen, completely absorbed, she stood there longer than she intended to. At 6:17 the following morning, the Aurora Mach 1 was at the test track. The announcement had gone out to the facility staff the previous night: mandatory attendance, full safety protocols, no media. 61 people stood in the observation area when the car was brought around. Emily stood at the front. Jack stood slightly to her left, his hands in the pockets of his jacket, his coffee in his hand, watching the car, the way a person watches something they have put care into. The test driver completed his pre-run checks. The car sat on the track in the early morning light, its profile low and aggressive and beautiful. every curve a functional decision, every surface earning its geometry. The engine note, when it came to life, was something between a sound and a physical event. The run began. At 40 miles per hour, the data monitors showed nominal readings. At 80, the systems responded exactly as designed. At 100, the active aerodynamics deployed in the precise sequence the architecture specified. At 140, the car was utterly, perfectly stable. At 162, the speed at which it had failed it held the line with a steadiness that felt, even through the monitor screens, like relief made physical. The test driver pushed it to 178 before the run length required braking. The telemetry came back clean. The car decelerated at the far end of the track, and for 2 full seconds nobody in the observation area said anything. They were looking at the monitors and at each other, and at the car, which was now slowing to a stop at the far end of the straight, its brake lights burning red in the pale morning air, and processing the gap between what they had feared and what had just happened. The numbers were right. The system had held. The car that was supposed to be impossible had just performed flawlessly, exactly as it was designed to, exactly as it was always supposed to, because one man had sat in a room for 6 hours and found the flaw that 40 engineers had missed. Someone in the observation area began to clap, and then everyone was clapping. And then people were shouting. And the driver climbed out of the car and raised both hands over his head, and around Emily the engineers were embracing each other with the unprofessional, completely human joy of people who had been staring into an abyss and had just stepped back from it. She stood very still in the middle of it and felt something move through her that she needed a moment to identify. Gratitude. Genuine, uncomplicated, slightly overwhelming gratitude. She turned to look at Jack. He was watching the car, a small, private expression on his face, not pride exactly, more the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman watching something work the way it should work. He became aware of her gaze and turned. "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate, and she knew it. And she said it anyway. He nodded once. "I owe you more than that," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "You owe the car a clean launch. That's what matters right now." She looked at him, this man she had dismissed in her lobby, whose truck she had mocked in front of her employees, whose quiet competence she had never paused to imagine, because she had been so completely certain that the story she saw on the surface was the whole story. She had spent her career learning to read data. She had spent her career demanding precision and accuracy in every system she was responsible for. And she had failed, at the most basic level, to apply any of those values to the way she evaluated a human being. "I need to say something to you," she said, "properly, not just here." He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to." "I know," she said. "That's not why I'm doing it." The company meeting was held on Friday morning. Emily had called it herself, which was unusual. Her all-hands gatherings were typically reserved for product launches or significant organizational announcements. The 612 employees of Carter Performance, across all departments, gathered in the main assembly hall. Emily stood at the podium in front of them, and she did not bring notes. She told them the story of Tuesday morning. She told it plainly, and without flattering herself in any detail. She described what she had seen: the truck, the man, the judgment she had formed before a single relevant fact was known. She described what she had said, in language close enough to the original that the people who had been present would recognize it. She described, with careful honesty, the process by which she had come to understand exactly how wrong she had been. "I want to talk about the kind of company we are," she said, "because I think we have to be honest about the ways leadership shapes culture. And I have not been the kind of leader who modeled the value I say we hold, which is that every person in this building is worth exactly as much as they contribute, not as much as they appear to contribute, not as much as their title suggests, not as much as their car implies, what they actually bring, who they actually are." She paused. Jack Miller saved this company's most important project. He saved it because he is, without qualification, one of the most gifted engineering minds of his generation. He was also the man I stood in this lobby and humiliated on Tuesday morning, because he drove a truck I found beneath the image of this facility. The hall was silent. It was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of people who are paying close attention, who have been given something real to look at and are looking at it. Emily had given presentations to rooms full of investors who had staked fortunes on her words, and she had never felt quite this exposed, not because this audience was more powerful, but because what she was saying could not be revised, could not be qualified out of consequence. She was not making an argument. She was making an account. There is a difference. "I was wrong," she said. "I'm standing here saying it to 600 people, because I need to mean it the way public things mean things completely." Without the option of taking it back, she looked at Jack, who was seated in the front row, and said, "I'm sorry, Jack. I'm genuinely sorry." He looked back at her. And then he stood, not because anyone had asked him to, not because the moment required it, but because he was a man who believed in meeting honesty with honesty. He said, into the waiting quiet of the room, "Thank you. I accept that." A pause. "And I want to say, I've worked in a lot of places in this industry, and the engineers in this building are exceptional. What went wrong with the Aurora wasn't a failure of talent. It was a compounding of small decisions made without full information. That happens. What matters is what you do when you find it." He sat down. The applause was not the loud, celebratory kind. It was the kind that carries weight, the kind that comes from people who have witnessed something true. And in the days and weeks that followed, something real shifted in the building, not loudly, not through a policy memo or a new set of values posted in the lobby, but in the quieter way that culture actually changes, which is through the choices individual people make when they believe their leadership means what it says. Engineers started introducing themselves to contractors by name. The front desk began keeping a list of technical visitors and their credentials. Someone nobody knew, who made a small sign for the lobby wall that read, "Expertise does not have a dress code." Emily left it there. Emily found Lily first at the science fair the following Thursday. It was not a planned encounter. Jack had mentioned offhandedly in one of their working sessions over the following days that his daughter had an exhibit on aerodynamic principles, which he had noted with the barely suppressed pride of a father who was professionally invested in the subject matter. Emily had made a decision that surprised her a little, found the school, and gone. Lily Miller was standing beside a trifold display board and a small working model of a low-drag wing profile, explaining lift coefficient to a parent who was clearly out of their depth but gamely nodding. She was small and precise and fierce about her subject in a way that made Emily stop several feet away and simply observe. When the parent moved on and Lily turned and noticed her, there was a brief moment of assessment, the same calm, steady evaluation that Emily had noticed in Jack from the beginning. Then Lily said, "You're the car lady. Dad said, you might come." Emily said, "He did?" He said, "You seemed like someone who does what she says." A pause. "He doesn't say that about a lot of people." They talked for 20 minutes about the wing model, about aerodynamic principles, about why certain shapes reduce drag and others increase it. Lily explained things with the clarity of someone who has learned from a teacher who believes precision matters. Emily found herself genuinely learning, and genuinely enjoying learning, and genuinely surprised by the quality of her own enjoyment. When Jack arrived, he stopped a short distance away and watched the two of them for a moment before making his presence known. There was something in his face in that moment, not quite surprise, more like the careful, hopeful attention of someone who wants something to be real but does not yet trust that it is. "She knows her aerodynamics," Emily said when he approached. "She does," he agreed. "Better than most of my interns." "Honestly," Lily said, with the unself-conscious directness of a 10-year-old. "Are you going to work together again?" Emily looked at Jack. Jack looked at Emily with the same measured quality he brought to all his observations. He did not rescue her from the question. "I hope so," Emily said. And she meant it in ways she did not fully articulate yet in professional terms. In personal terms. In the terms of someone who has recognized, belatedly and with some cost, that the world contains more value than is immediately visible, and that the work of becoming someone who sees clearly is ongoing and not always comfortable. Jack spent the next several weeks at Carter Performance in a consulting capacity, working with the Aurora team to complete the validation testing and prepare the car for its launch. He came and went on a schedule that accommodated Lily never early enough to miss breakfast with her. Always home before her bedtime. The engineering team adapted to this without complaint. In part because they had collectively decided that Jack Miller could show up whenever he pleased, and they would be grateful. The working relationship between Jack and Emily was, in those weeks, professional in its structure and quietly something else in its texture. They disagreed about things. She was decisive in ways that sometimes outran the data. He was deliberate in ways that sometimes frustrated her pace. They argued about these differences with the specific sharpness of two people who respect each other's intelligence enough not to soften their positions. They also talked about other things. He told her about the early days of Sarah's illness, the decisions that followed, the specific grief of watching a life reorganize itself around a loss. She told him about the years before the company's turnaround, the investors who hadn't believed in her, the board meetings where she had sat in rooms with older men who thought her youth was a liability and had proven, one quarter at a time, that they were wrong. They were two people who had learned to be capable under pressure. They recognized each other in this, the way survivors sometimes recognize each other across a room. She noticed, over those weeks, the texture of his attention. Jack Miller listened with the same quality he brought to data, not waiting for a gap to speak, but genuinely absorbing what was being said, turning it, examining it. It was a quality she had not encountered often in her professional life, where meetings tended to be composed largely of people waiting for their turn. She found herself saying things in his presence she had not planned to say, not because he asked the right questions, but because he created the kind of quiet that made honesty feel natural. She told him once, in the break room at 8 in the evening, that she was not certain she liked the person she had been before this month. He had considered that for a moment and said, "You don't have to be certain. You just have to do something about it." She had held on to that. He maintained a careful distance, as he maintained care in all things. Lily was his first loyalty, and he did not complicate his life or hers without consideration. But he stopped keeping himself entirely at arm's length. He brought Lily to the facility on a Saturday when the engineers were running calibration tests, and watching his daughter ask incisive questions of a team that was delighted to answer them, he allowed himself to feel something he had not let himself feel in quite some time. The particular warmth of a life that might be expanding again, rather than contracting. The recognition of Jack Miller's foundational contribution to the Aurora's control architecture was made official 6 weeks after the launch. Emily brought the matter to the board herself, with documentation she had compiled with Dennis Falk's help, detailing the provenance of the core design elements and the extent to which the current system derived from Jack's original work. The intellectual property arrangement was renegotiated. A retroactive licensing agreement was structured. A formal credit acknowledgement was added to every technical document associated with the Aurora program. The company hosted a small ceremony, deliberately not a spectacle, because Jack was not a man who wanted spectacle. The engineering team was present. Dennis Falk gave a brief, technical, entirely sincere speech about the nature of the contribution. Emily presented Jack with the documentation that bore his name in the place it had always deserved to be. Jack accepted it without performance, read the first page in the particular careful way he read everything, and said, "This is fair," which, from Jack Miller, was a complete endorsement. Lily was there. She stood beside her father in her good jacket. And when he accepted the folder, she reached up and squeezed his hand once, with the fierce, economical love of a child who has learned that some moments do not require elaboration. Jack looked down at her, and something moved across his face, the specific, private expression of a father who is being seen exactly as he is by the person whose opinion matters most. He had not told Lily much about the details of the past weeks. She knew the broad shape of it, that there had been a problem with a car, that he had helped fix it, that people had been kind to him. He had not told her about the lobby, He had made a decision, long ago, not to teach her grievance as a reflex. There were things worth holding on to, and things worth setting down. And bitterness was always in the second category, but standing in the room with the folder in his hands, seeing his name printed on documents that would be kept and referenced for as long as the Aurora existed, he felt something loosen in him that he had not known was tight. The work had always mattered. Now it was also visible. That was not nothing. That was not a small thing. The Aurora McQuan launched on a Saturday in October, to the gathered media and investors and the polished presentation that Emily's team had spent 4 years building toward. The car performed flawlessly. The reviews, when they came, were extraordinary, not merely praising the vehicle's performance, but calling the control architecture a generational leap, the kind of engineering that reframes what the category can be. Several publications noted, after the technical credits were updated and made available, that the foundational design was the work of Jack Miller, who had developed the core framework years before, and whose contribution had been finally and fully acknowledged. Emily read those lines standing in the parking lot of the facility on a Monday morning, on her phone, beside a car that was not quite the one she had arrived in every morning for the past 4 years. She had made one change. On the far side of the lot, she had designated a space. She had done it quietly, without announcement, and in it sat Jack's old pickup truck, which Jack drove to the facility several days a week in its patient, unhurried way. The designation marker read simply, "Reserved." It had been her idea, and she had not told him about it until it was done. And when he had seen it, he had looked at her for a long moment and then said, in a tone she was still learning to read, that it was a good parking space. They stood together one evening in late October at the edge of the test facility lot, Emily, Jack, and Lily, who had been brought along because it was a Saturday, and because Lily had asked to see the Aurora in person, and there was no good reason to say no. The hypercar sat under the facility lights in the particular stillness of a machine at rest, its surfaces catching the light in the efficient, purposeful way of something that had been designed to do exactly what it was doing. 20 feet away, Jack's pickup sat in its designated space, decades older, carrying all its dents and its faded paint and its years, holding between its worn metal panels the particular kind of weight that only a kept thing can carry. Lily looked at both vehicles for a long time. Then she looked up at her father and said, "Your truck helped build that car." Jack considered this. It was not literally true, and also, in all the ways that mattered, completely true. "Yeah," he said. "I guess it did." Emily stood beside him in the quiet of the evening, and she thought about the distance between what a thing looked like and what a thing was, and how her entire professional life had been built on the premise that she could read the difference between a viable investment and a losing one, between a design that would perform and one that would fail, between the surface of a thing and its actual value. She had been wrong about something obvious, and she had not known it, and the cost of not knowing had come very close to being very large. The work of seeing clearly was ongoing. She was beginning to understand that it always would be. The evening settled in around them. The test facility's floodlights hummed. Lily had found something in the gravel near the fence that required her complete attention. Jack sipped his coffee in the comfortable quiet of a man who does not fill silence with noise, and Emily stood beside him and thought that the most valuable things she had acquired in the past 2 months had nothing to do with the launch, nothing to do with the contracts or the coverage or the company's restored trajectory. They were smaller and harder to quantify. An understanding of her own blind spots. The beginning of a friendship she had not seen coming. A 10-year-old's explanation of lift coefficient that she still thought about. The knowledge that value does not announce itself. That it shows up in worn trucks and flannel shirts and quiet voices that do not need to be raised to be worth hearing. A person could spend a lifetime building something impressive and miss what was actually standing right in front of them. The cost of that error was not always recoverable. She had been lucky. She knew it. She intended to do something with the luck. Jack turned and looked at her, and there was a question in his expression that was also the beginning of something she thought she recognized. She met it honestly, which was the only way she knew to meet things now. "Same time Monday?" she asked. 7:30, he said. Lily called from the fence. "Dad, I found a feather." Jack said, "Hold it gently." He walked toward his daughter, and Emily watched him go. And above the test facility, the October sky had gone a deep clear blue, the kind that comes at the end of the day when the light has said everything it has to say, and the dark has not yet arrived to say anything different. 2 vehicles sat in the lot. One was the future. One was the record of everything it had taken to get there. Between them, a man knelt beside his daughter to look at a feather in her palm. And the distance between those 2 machines, between flash and substance, between appearance and truth, was exactly the length of a lesson worth learning. Talent is quiet. Kindness is consistent. What lasts is not the impression a person makes on first glance, but what they leave behind when no one is looking, the foundations others build upon, the care given without credit, the love kept steady through years that ask too much. A person's worth is not in what they drive, or where they park, or what their address says about them. It lives in what they build, and in how they treat the people they meet along the way, and in whether, at the end of a long day, someone who loves them runs across a parking lot to find them. That is the whole of it. Everything else is surface.